So this semester I had the opportunity to honors option Evolutionary Biology with Dr. Milne, and it was a really cool experience. We looked at a different article each month based off of the topics we were talking about in class, and it really gave me the opportunity to explore them deeper and really comprehend the material. So beginning in January, we looked at early ideas about evolution. We started with William Paley in 1802 and part of his book, Natural Theology. William Paley was a very religious man, and he took more of a special creationist perspective on evolution. So, evolution and natural selection weren't really heard of at the time, but his ideas did reign true during this time period. His ideas were widely accepted. We know that is no longer the case, but at the time, his ideas were the ideas about evolution and natural selection at the time. He is most well known for the watchmaker analogy, which brings into play ideas about irreducible complexity, which is basically the fact that things are assembled so perfectly and so meticulously and so well designed that they couldn't possibly be anything but created by a maker. So he uses a watch example and how the little cogs of a watch only work when they're assembled just so and put together in a specific manner. And he also applies irreducible complexity to the eye, the camera eye, and says that the eye as well is so complex and so finite that it could not have been formed through evolution, and rather it was created by someone because it is so perfect. This brings into play specific questions about evolution and natural selection, and how can natural selection even be reasonable when everything only seems to work when things are assembled just so. Next, we'll look at Jean Lamarck and his zoological philosophy, published in 1809. He had a lot of early ideas about adaptation and environmental pressures and how the environment kind of shapes the organism. He also had a lot of early ideas about vestigial structures. While he didn't use that word, he largely focused on the use and disuse theory. So, if an organ was used or a certain trait was used, then it was what was passed on to the next generation, or that is what thrived, and disuse would cause something to completely disappear. While he was kind of on track, he wasn't quite on track, because animals are selected for having certain traits, not because they needed them. He talks about snakes and how snakes became elongated and lost their legs because they were navigating through narrow spaces, which caused their body to elongate. It also kind of reminded me of the giraffes and how they say that giraffes got long necks because they're eating from high trees. Well, no, that's not really the case. So we know that's no longer true, but his ideas made sense, especially given the time period, only a few years after William Paley's ideas. Finally, we looked at Charles Darwin and his On the Origin of Species, published in 1859. He laid out a very good, logical, solid argument. He had a lot of early ideas. He had the first early phylogenetic tree. Of course, natural selection and evolution. He knew that natural selection was not the only mechanism, but it's a very important mechanism. He talks about evolution being a daily scrutinizing process, which kind of alludes to microevolution. He also looks at adaptations. His postulates are mentioned in the first few pages, such as variation among organisms, more individuals are born than will survive, and some variants survive and reproduce at better rates than others. So, just a couple of his postulates, and his ideas were revolutionary. A lot of people read his work, but his work was heavily debated during his time. He was very humble and didn't often publicly defend his work, but he obviously had very strong ideas that are still true today. This is a painting that I saw at the Toledo Museum of Art. I'm from Toledo, Ohio, and my suite mate came and visited me over break, and we went to the art museum, and I saw this painting, and I thought it was so cool, because as soon as I saw it, I was like, this has to be about evolution. And so basically, it's a satire. The monkeys are like, hey, we can't be related to this thing. So it's supposed to be a satire, but it actually groups the guy with anti-Darwinian ideas. And that kind of makes sense, because this was done in 1891, so not too long after Darwin's work was published, and we can see that it was obviously still heavily debated at the time. Next up, in February, we looked at alternatives to adaptation, and we read an article by Stephen Jay Gould, who is a very famous biologist, most well known for his island biogeography theories, and we looked at how there are numerous alternatives to adaptation that can explain why organisms are the way they are without taking an adaptationist perspective. The article spends a lot of time comparing adaptive features to spandrels and say that adaptations are instead byproducts of something else and not adaptations. So first, what's a spandrel? It is basically the result of two arches being formed. It's the triangular space between two arches, and they're saying that a spandrel is there just as a byproduct of the two arches. It's not there for any special reason. Although they may be ornate and beautiful, as in this photo, they're not there for any real reason. So then he kind of goes into the adaptationist program and looks at some people such as Alfred Russel Wallace who adhere to this, who look strictly at adaptation. A really nice quote from the article is that our world may not be good in an abstract sense, but it is the best we could have. Each trait plays its part and must be as is. So I think that does a nice job of laying out the adaptationist perspective and how everything must be as it is. But the authors like to argue that if it fails, there must be alternatives to adaptation and adaptive ideas. So if one fails, they're trying to encourage the reader and other scientists to try other alternatives that don't necessarily have anything to do with adaptation. Natural selection is not the only answer, and it's not exclusive. So Darwin himself was a pluralist and believed that while natural selection is the most important mechanism, there's a lot of other mechanisms at work that make organisms the way they are. So finally, the most important part of the paper are they lay out a lot of the alternatives to adaptation. Some of these ideas are that there is no adaptation and no selection. Rather, the way organisms are based off of genetic drift, random fixation, and new mutations, all topics we're familiar with and aren't necessarily adaptation. Also, we have no adaptation and no selection on the part at issue. So that may sound a little confusing, but the following part to that is the form of the part is a correlated consequence of selection directed elsewhere. So basically it's describing a trade-off, and a nice explanation of this kind of trade-off would be that in humans, our hips got wider for easier birth, but this made it harder to run from predators like big cats. And then also genetic hitchhiking, which indicates positive selection on a linked trait, but again is not adaptation. It also talks about phenotypic plasticity, which isn't adaptation itself, but the ability to adapt and change. And then one of the coolest alternatives it talks about was adaptation and selection, but adaptation is a secondary utilization. So basically, in this example, they talk about blushing and how our cheeks turn red when we blush, but blushing isn't the reason why our blood is red. Our blood is red for many different reasons that don't have anything to do with blushing. So kind of a cool, vivid description of one of the alternatives to adaptation and why it's so important to take another perspective. Next, we looked at Eusociality and the famous article put forth by Nowak and some other associated authors. There was a lot of controversy surrounding this article. Nowak, among the other authors that published this paper, were well-renowned, so when they spoke, other people listened. But this article caused a lot of controversy, very heated, very divided scientific community. Eusociality is seen as a challenge to natural selection. Altruism, in Darwin's own words, is very hard to explain with natural selection, so this paper does a good job at trying to explain that. They talk about it's controversial because they claim that inclusive fitness and kin selection fail, they claim that Hamilton's rule fails, and they claim that there are few proper empirical tests testing inclusive fitness. Overall, this is a very minority opinion. It's not the view taken by most of the scientific community, but it was a very important paper. They did a great job of exploring the weaknesses of inclusive fitness. First, they looked at the haplodiploidy hypothesis theory, which we also looked at in class, and it says that haplodiploidy is a consequence rather than a cause of eusociality. They also implicitly look at the Red Queen hypothesis by talking about genetic variability and how in the Red Queen hypothesis you are increasing genetic variability because you are competing with other organisms, whereas in eusociality and having that caste system of organisms, you're not increasing genetic variability, so it's harder to combat diseases and basically harder to thrive as a community. It also says that inclusive fitness is not a general theory of evolution. There are many, many strict assumptions that go with inclusive fitness. So natural selection itself is more generalizable and can be used for a lot more theory. So they're arguing that why not just stick with natural selection. Also, they talk about the prisoner's dilemma and how cooperation can happen regardless of relatedness. Finally, they explain their alternate theory of eusociality. They talk about the formation of groups. They also discuss pre-adaptive traits, which causes groups to be more tightly formed. Basically, they're describing nesting and, as a result, adaptive radiation. The third point here, they're discussing the origin of eusocial alleles by recombination or mutation. Basically, these alleles that form cancel out the desire to make a new home, to start a new nest, so encourages them to be eusocial. They talk about emergent traits shaped through natural selection by environmental forces, and also multi-level selection driving change. So this is their alternative model of eusociality. As you can see, there's some similarities to the traditional model of eusociality, but this is their explanation. Lastly, we looked at human evolution and an article about how we may have coexisted with another early human species more recently than we thought. So it's basically about the discovery of Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores in Indonesia. And it first lays out how Homo floresiensis couldn't possibly be another species, how it couldn't be part of another species and was rather its own species. So it's described as the most extreme hominin ever discovered and is believed to be a dwarf descendant of Homo erectus, which would involve seed crossing, which we'll talk a bit about later. It was also thought that it could possibly be a convergent ape. There could have been some convergent evolution, but also that is not the case because there are far too many hominin traits. They thought it could be Australopithecine, but no, there are too many traits within the Homo genus. And then they also thought it could be a pygmy Homo sapien, but again, they believe that not to be the case because there are many key skull and brain differences. In a pygmy Homo sapien, normally the brain and skull size doesn't vary much, but the ratios on the skull are much different, making it very, very different from a Homo sapien. Something we found really interesting that kind of explains Homo floresiensis' size is island dwarfism. So when I think of island dwarfism, I think of Gulliver's Travels, not the book, the movie, because I didn't read the book, but where like Jack Black comes to the island and all the people are really, really tiny. It has a little bit to do with biogeography and the fact that islands are isolated, so organisms will come over from the mainland, and on the island, the competition, resources, predation is all very different from what they're used to. So if there is increased predation, decreased resources, increased competition, the smaller organisms are selected for and can survive because they can thrive in that type of environment, which again could explain why Homo floresiensis is so small. Now, the opposite of this is island gigantism, where if there is decreased competition, increased resources, and decreased predation, organisms can increase in size and thrive in that manner. This is much slower. Island dwarfism is actually very rapid, and again, why they think Homo floresiensis could be so small. Also, it does a great job of painting the picture that despite culture, early humans are still subject to evolutionary rules. So very fascinating to think about. Finally, the article kind of dove into multi-regional evolution and how the discovery of Homo floresiensis kind of fueled the debate over modern human origin, kind of pitted the African replacement model against the multi-regional evolution model, but it kind of destroys the multi-evolution model because it requires a large population with little isolation, which is the exact opposite of Homo floresiensis. It was found on a small island, so isolated, likely didn't have a very large population, and obviously they couldn't exchange genes with other populations. So, as the article says, it puts another nail in the multi-regional coffin. Lastly, something we found really interesting with this species is that their ancestors would have had to cross the sea. So that's a pretty extreme feat for an organism to do. This is seen as a very sapient behavior, but it's pretty cool to think that sea crossing began so early in our evolutionary history. In closing, I learned that there are so many different evolutionary biology perspectives out there. It really helped to show me that evolution isn't linear, it's branching, it happens simultaneously. It's not one thing becoming the next, everything's evolving at the same time, which is something that, I've never really considered before. These articles really helped me comprehend the material in class and dive deeper, and it was overall really fascinating. So I had a great semester doing this, And I really enjoyed seeing these different perspectives, so I hope you did too.